What dating was like in the Victorian era. Love is a universal feeling that everyone experiences at the least expected times. People fall in love every day. Many couples go through first, second, and third dates, but you can also add other romantic milestones to that typical dating scene. You could go on a coffee date, or maybe dinner and a movie, hit some bars with your friends, or maybe have a double date. Those are all fun ways to get to know someone and make lasting memories with each other. But what if you were living in the Victorian era? Would dating be different then? In today's video, we will talk about this topic. So watch the video till the end because you will be amazed to know what Victorian dating was like in the past. So let's start without wasting any time. Victorian dating was much more formal than it is today. Dating was a very formal process and it involved a lot of waiting around. While dating is often thought of as the 21st century's version of finding a partner, back in Victorian times, it was more like an arranged marriage. If you were lucky enough to be born into money or status, then you would likely be betrothed by your parents when you were still young. However, if you weren't part of the upper class, and especially if you weren't female, then finding love was much more difficult. In order to find someone who would want to marry them and support them financially, many people had to rely on matchmakers instead of their parents' approval. This led many women into becoming prostitutes because they couldn't afford their own way through life without help from family members who didn't approve of their choices, or even disapproved outright because they felt that prostitution wasn't appropriate behavior for females at all. There were some pretty strict rules to abide by. In the Victorian era, there were some pretty strict rules to abide by if you wanted to court a member of the opposite sex. Here are some things that were considered appropriate at the time. Courtship was done in secret so as to not scandalize friends and family. An engaged couple couldn't be seen together before their wedding day. A man had to propose marriage with his hand on his heart or on his knees if he was kneeling. He also had to ask permission from his future wife's father first. Couples who were courting couldn't even kiss or hold hands until they were engaged. And even then, it was only allowed under certain conditions, like being out in public where no one could see them. The Victorians had a love of dinner parties. It was the most common ways for couples to meet and interact with each other, as this was before social media and dating apps. Dinner parties were carefully planned events where guests would be invited by their hosts, often with the intention of bringing together compatible people who might enjoy each other's company. Proper etiquette dictated that hosts select guests based on age, gender, occupation, and marital status. These rules could make it difficult for single people to find suitable partners at some events. Dress codes were very strict during this period. Women were expected to wear gloves at all times, even when eating, as well as hats or bonnets. Men were expected to wear tuxedos or full suits throughout most of their lives, unless they were working. Men didn't need to ask permission to date women. In fact, they were expected to ask women out. For example, if a man approached a woman in public and asked her for her phone number or if she wanted to go on a date with him, it was seen as romantic, not creepy. Men could also initiate contact with women through letters and telegrams, which were common ways of communicating at the time. If a man wanted to see his crush again after their first meeting or even before, he could just write her another letter asking her if she wants another date. Women also had some control over who they dated because they didn't have their parents' consent until they got married. This means that teenage girls could choose whether or not they wanted to go on dates with boys who approached them at parties or school functions without getting permission from their parents first. And even then, it was still up for debate whether parents would allow their daughters out late at night without supervision. Couples would write each other letters. If you were a young couple in the Victorian era, you would communicate with each other through letters. This was the only way to communicate. As a result, people's letters were more formal and less informal than they are today. So they could be read by other people if they had to be delivered somewhere else or something like that. But even though they were more formal than our modern-day emails and texts, letters were still an effective tool for getting to know someone. And it wasn't just because no one wanted to use their precious minutes on Snapchat. Instead of talking about what music we like or how our day went at work, like we might do now, couples wrote about deeper topics such as their feelings for each other or their family's histories. Gifts were always given during courtship. During the Victorian era, gifts were an essential part of courtship. Gifts were often given to express affection and show gratitude. The frequency and type of gift given varied depending on social class. For example, it was not uncommon for a man in the upper class to give his fiancée, the woman he was going to marry, jewelry as a wedding gift. A lower class man might give his fiancée something more practical, like a new set of linens for their home, or some clothing items that were considered appropriate for women at the time, such as lace collars. Gifts were also given during holidays such as Christmas, Easter, and birthdays. These were usually small tokens, such as candy cane sticks or handkerchiefs, but sometimes they could be much more elaborate if one had enough money available. Christmas was a romantic time of year for hand-holding and singing carols together. In Victorian England, Christmas was a time of year when the church was most important. However, there were some romantic customs for those who did have partners, like hand-holding and singing carols together. Proposals had certain rules as well. Proposals were a big deal, but they had rules as well. Proposal etiquette dictated that the man be romantic and that the woman be impressed. It was all about creating an impression of love and romance togetherness, with a good sense of humor thrown in for good measure. The proposal ceremony was often public and elaborate, so much so that some people made it a point to invite friends over to witness the event. Engagement rings were symbolic. An engagement ring was a symbol of a woman's status and wealth. While it wasn't mandatory for women to wear them, they were common among the upper classes. Ladies would often have multiple rings, allowing them to change styles when it suited their fancy. These rings were usually made from gold or silver with gems set in the center of them. The gemstones would be chosen based on how much wealth the woman had at her disposal. More money meant more expensive stones. Engagements back then could last years. The Victorian era was a time of high emotion and expectation, but it also provided couples with the opportunity to take their time in choosing the right partner. While engagements are more commonly known today as the period before marriage when you spend all your free time together, in Victorian England, they had other purposes. They served as a way for both parties to test compatibility on several levels before making a lifelong commitment. Couples could use them as an opportunity to test their financial situation together. They were also used as a way for families and friends alike to get to know each other better before getting married. Women weren't expected to date multiple people. In the Victorian era, women weren't expected to date multiple people. They were also not supposed to be intimate before marriage, which is a big part of why they were expected to remain chaste. It's easy to imagine that this was an oppressive standard for women, and it certainly was, but you should also keep in mind that these standards were designed with the best intentions in mind. Women weren't allowed out without a chaperone or escorted by someone who could vouch for them, usually their father. This meant that there was no room for affairs or relationships outside of marriage. In fact, it's likely that many young couples married because their families wanted them to. The concept of falling in love wasn't really something people thought about back then. Dating was done with a chaperone. Victorian courtship rituals were a lot more formal than modern ones. There was an official date schedule that you had to follow if you wanted to keep up appearances and not get branded as a disgrace in society's eyes. The proper Victorian dating ritual usually consisted of a young lady going out with her chaperone, usually either her mother or older sister, to visit some sort of public places like the park, zoo, or museum. They would have lunch together before attending church services or heading back home for tea time. The couple could only talk while at these functions. They weren't allowed to be alone until they became engaged or married. Date nights were all about cultural activities like attending the theater or opera. Also, dating in the Victorian era was all about cultural activities. You and your date might attend a theater or an opera, go to concerts, visit museums and art galleries together, or even watch a movie at one of the era's early movie theaters. If you're looking for something more romantic than these public venues, and let's be honest, we all are, try taking your sweetheart on a carriage ride through Central Park or along Boston Harbor. For an even more intimate setting that won't attract too much attention from onlookers and gossip alike, consider going for an evening stroll through the park after dark together. Women weren't allowed to have male friends or talk with men unattended. If you were from a wealthy family, you were expected to be chaperoned at all times, especially when it came to dating. Even if you were just out shopping alone, people would think twice about whether or not they should approach you. After all, until you were married by age 18, or out of season as it was called, girls were seen as young ladies who had yet to grow into their places as wives and mothers. As such, only women who did make it past this age without marrying would be considered eligible for marriage partners. And even then, they still had quite a few hoops to jump through before being deemed worthy enough for a man's attention. Now let's take a look at some examples of what happened if a girl didn't follow these rules. It wasn't much fun. What it was like to be single in Victorian times. You had to ask someone's father for permission before you could marry them. And they would probably make you wait until they thought your family was good enough. If you were lucky enough to find a girl who didn't care that you were poor or how old you were, she would probably get engaged to someone else by the end of the season. During the winter months, people wouldn't go out unless absolutely necessary because of all the illnesses and diseases that could be passed around at dances or parties. While the dating scene in the Victorian era was a bit more formal and conservative than it is today, it certainly wasn't without its merits. For example, men wouldn't have to worry about when or if their date was on them because there weren't any phones. And women wouldn't need to worry about if they were attractive enough, since they could just get married instead of trying to find Mr. Right. Well, that's all for this video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more videos about history, please leave us a comment below. We love hearing from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.